Hello, and welcome to another episode of Let's Reconnect, the podcast for parents wanting to reconnect with their children and teens, and for professionals who want to support families to do the same. I'm your host, Brianna Jane Sarda, and I'm so happy that you can be here with us today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast is being recorded, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be listening today. Just a quick note before we begin. I am a registered psychologist, but all the information on this podcast is general in nature and does not substitute personalised professional mental health advice. If you are worried about yourself or someone that you love, please reach out to a qualified mental health professional for support. You can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14, the Kids Helpline on 1800 55 1800, or if you're in an emergency, you can always call 000. Welcome everyone to another episode of Let's Reconnect. I'm your host, Brianna Jane Sarda, and this episode is all about the rise in homeschooling in Australia and the kids leaving mainstream school and going to alternate settings. So if you've been speaking to other parents lately, or maybe you work in schools, you might have noticed that there has been a little bit of a shift. So more and more families are questioning if mainstream education is right for them and their child. And for some, many are making the decision to actually leave mainstream schooling altogether. So across Australia, we are seeing a significant rise in the rates of homeschooling and people stepping away from traditional schooling. Registrations for homeschool in Australia in some of the states and territories has actually doubled since 2020. Some of these states are reporting that this isn't just a temporary COVID issue, as people thought it might have been at the time, because many families have now chosen to stay and many have left recently and are choosing homeschooling instead. We've got organisations like the Australian Institute of Family Studies reporting that there's increasing concerns around school disengagement, attendance issues, and what's often referred as school refusal, or for what some families would refer to as school can't. We're also seeing rising levels of psychological distress in our young people, with data from the ABS showing that many adolescents are experiencing higher levels of anxiety and overwhelm than we've seen in previous generations. There's a growing awareness around neurodiversity that's happening at the same time. If you listen to some of our recent episodes, you'd be aware of that. And more families are recognizing that just for some children, mainstream school isn't flexible enough for their needs, or it can feel quite overwhelming and is just not the right fit. This episode is not about whether school is a good or bad thing, or about whether leaving school is the right or wrong thing. It's about understanding what is happening and why more families are making that decision to leave. We need to consider what's right for the child, and if they're struggling within our school system, what's in their best interest. So today I'm joined by Alecia Hancock, a mum who has navigated this decision herself recently with her son. And also she's the owner of an allied health clinic in Western Australia in Perth called ND Perspectives, who support neurodivergent children, teens and adults. So she brings today a personal and a professional perspective to this conversation. Alecia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I think it's a really important topic and something people need to be a little bit more aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the numbers are actually really interesting. If you have a look at kind of what's happening across the country, this isn't a state issue. There's not kind of one state. We're kind of seeing this across the board. There's kids leaving mainstream school. And as I mentioned before, you recently made this decision within your family for your son to leave mainstream school. Can you tell us how long ago that was?
But it was definitely a decision that we had to make. So it happened, I guess not all at once, almost sort of as a bit of a gradual process, but probably mid last year, we started to explore different options and decide whether mainstream school was going to suit us. At term 4 of last year, we officially started with some homeschooling and got my registration for that.
Yeah, I was going to ask. That's a whole other conversation. I'd love to hear a little bit about what that process is like and how you're finding that as well. But I guess what were the kind of the signs that made you as a family start considering whether mainstream was going to be a long-term decision for you, or if you needed to make that jump to an alternate setting?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's a little hard to pinpoint exactly the signs because it was such a gradual process. But for us, it definitely started with the transition to high school. So when we moved from primary school to high school, that was a really difficult time. The transition was tough, but we thought it kind of settled and we were doing okay. We got through sort of the first year 7, which, I still think kids are still too young to be in high school in year 7, but we sort of got through that year, and it was coming into year 8 that things started to get a lot harder. So my son's autistic and ADHD, has some challenges around anxiety and things like that as well. And as things progressed throughout that year, we started seeing that school can't. And personally, I think that's a really great term that started emerging because it isn't almost a choice for our neurodivergent kids. It's not that they're saying, I don't want to go to school, I don't like it. It is almost that paralyzing effect of, I just can't get through these barriers. And that's certainly what we experienced. So it was a gradual process where it was harder and harder to sort of get up and get going each day, more stress around even thinking about school. And we got to that point that we were missing more and more time, that we started to have to look seriously about where we were at. And that's the time where I started doing a little bit more research myself. And as you say, found this really growing movement towards moving out of mainstream school, started reading a lot more articles and seeing a lot of the same statistics you've probably seen as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And was this something that kind of was this your idea? Was it your partner's idea? Was this something that came from your son? Who was kind of the first one to kind of say, I can't do this anymore?
It's a really great question. It wasn't so much even a choice. We got to the point that we kind of had the conversation that we felt like we were having to make a choice between his well-being and mental health and education. And that's a really difficult position to be in as a parent, to feel like it was an either or decision. But we had gotten to the point with term 3 of last year that he'd only been in school a few days here and there. We were missing more school than we were going to, and it just wasn't sustainable to continue that way. And it's a combination of factors, and we can certainly get into that a little bit more about what sort of our autistic kids particularly experience in school, high school or primary school. But there are a lot of factors that cause it to be a lot more challenging for our kids than for others. But it was a really gradual process. And we sort of initially moved into a bit more of a, from my homework, a bit more of an unschooling thing for a little while. It wasn't meant to be permanent. It was just taking a break, spending a little bit of time to re-energize and come back out of that burnout a little bit. But it ended up being a lot bigger journey than we expected, because we got to that point where we realized that just going back to where we were wasn't going to be the right choice for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess you've spoken a little bit about the difficulty getting up and kind of
Mm.
getting to school, and you worried about mental health and well-being, which I think is, needs to be at the center of the decision. Absolutely. Was stuff going on? Were you seeing things at home, or was it just that he didn't want to go to school? Was home life also more challenging for everyone?
Not so much, really. It was really, everything was focused around school. So we could see, once we started exploring what was going on, declining mental health, declining well-being, happiness, I guess as, a neurodivergent kid, going to new places, exploring new things, social situations can be challenging at the best of times. And I'm neurodivergent myself, late diagnosed ADHD. I can certainly empathize with that. And we were seeing those things escalating to some extent, less desire to go out in the world, less desire to explore new things, because everything else during the school day was draining all of that energy, draining all of that kind of passion. And there was just nothing left by the time we got home. But for the most part, we could see very clearly that the change and the problem was coming from that school environment. And there are so many reasons that neurodivergent kids do struggle in a school environment. And if we think about things from that lens, it actually starts to make a lot more sense. So obviously, every autistic person, every autistic individual, neurodiverse person is different. It has different strengths, different challenges, different, levels of sensitivity. But there are so many different things that can factor in. And so much of that is just out of a neurodivergent person's ability to control. So whether it's sensitivity to light and the classrooms are bright, or whether it's noise, you can't control how much noise is in a classroom. You can't control your own schedule or have control of what time you get in or you do a certain thing. So many things happen during the day that are unexpected. You don't have the normal in sort of, when working through challenges, you do a lot of preemptive education and managing expectations of what's going to happen and how things are going to happen. That doesn't often happen during the school day. And there's very different levels of understanding in the school system. Some teachers are fabulous. Some teachers have a really great experience. Some schools are really supportive. Others aren't. So there's so many different things, right down from having to put on a uniform, which might have seams that rub on the
Yeah.
skin, and, socks
Those
that aren't super
sensory
comfortable.
issues.
And
Yeah.
exactly. And all those little things start to build up. And for us, certainly we saw that come to a head more in that shift from primary school to high school. And I probably as a parent didn't realize exactly how much more significant that difference was going to be. And certainly I was aware of the challenges and we managed them as best we could. But over time, all of those little things build up. So it's in primary school, to some extent, you're dealing with one teacher for most of the time who can be aware of your needs and your situation. When you're in high school, you're moving a lot more. You're moving between classrooms where there's more noise, more crowds. You've gone from being the biggest kid in school to being the youngest again, and suddenly thrust in an environment where, you're around people who are essentially adults and having much more adult conversations and more sophisticated level of social interaction than what you experienced in primary school. Each classroom you walk into is a different adult in charge with different expectations and different environments. The room is different, different temperatures, all of these things that maybe we don't always think about can really cause a lot of drain on someone who is neurodivergent and can't necessarily control exactly how much information their brain is processing. So all of that kind of pressure, the requirement, and I know you've spoken about this in previous episodes, but the requirement to sort of fit into a neurotypical space is exhausting and draining.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're hitting the nail on the head, Alicia, in a few issues. And like you said, it's not just one of these factors. They build up, and you might be able to tolerate a couple of challenges, the itchy uniform or the temperature. But then when you put that with the noise, and then when you put that with it's a different teacher, and maybe because you don't see these teachers as often as you did in primary school, the relationships aren't there. There's different peers who might not be as accepting or tolerant of maybe some of our kids that have some neurodiversity. All of that coupled up, it kind of layers and layers. I'm interested from a professional perspective. I want to hear that angle too. But just as a mum, with your mum hat on for a moment, what was it like being a parent in that situation? I'm a mum. I've got two kids. What was it like being a mum and seeing your child struggle like that? Was that, I can't imagine.
So awful. Yeah, so awful. And as a mum, I'm sure you can imagine. It's a really difficult thing to be in that position where you can see your child is hurting and they're struggling and not knowing how to help them. Because I guess, for our family, we sort of look back when we were the same age, there weren't the opportunities and the pathways that there are now. And that took us a little while to get past, because it was always just, for both myself and my husband, it was a thing. You got up, you went to school. That was just what was expected of you at that age. It's just what you did. We were both, kind of good kids who just did what we were told. And there weren't a lot of options. And when we sort of found ourselves in this position and had to start looking at different pathways, it is hard to sometimes shake off that the way we were brought up and what was expected of us, and start to look at things a little bit differently.
The kind of put up and shut up kind of mentality.
A little bit. And, while neither of us particularly loved high school or were kids that really, thrived in that environment, and we can certainly look back and, I had my own experiences of being bullied in high school, and, we had our own kind of journeys. It's a really difficult thing to be able to sort of put aside your own preconceived ideas of this is just the way things are supposed to happen and we just have to do it because that's what you do. But also being able to look at this individual person that's sitting there that's hurting and that's struggling in a really bad place, and having to go, they can't control this environment. Sure, we could look at choosing a different school or a different situation, but it wasn't going to remove those fundamental challenges that essentially schools are developed for a neurotypical perspective. They're not designed to be neurodivergent-based spaces. And while we were lucky, the school we were in were wonderful and super supportive and really flexible and doing kind of everything they could within their capability, I also feel a lot for teachers these days, in that we are still fundamentally in a system where you have one teacher with potentially, 30 students in the room who all have different perspectives, different needs, different levels of ability, academic, experience. And there's only so much that person can do in that situation. So we're all kind of a little bit in a framework. So we really did reach that point where we said, it's not this school specifically that's a problem. It's the system that's not really designed for a neurodivergent person. And we had to start looking at different options and shed some of those preconceived ideas and figure out what was going to be in the best interest of our son.
Yeah, I'm so glad you were working with a school that you felt was trying to work with you. I'm really lucky. I get to work with some great teachers and some great schools that make as many adjustments as they reasonably can. But like you said, sometimes we're working within a model of schooling that just doesn't fit the best interests of some of our students that might have diverse needs, whether that be neurodiversity or learning needs or mental health needs. It could be an array of things. But yes, they're doing the best they can, but they also only have certain resources or tools available to them. And yeah, it potentially is a bit of a question about, okay, well, is this, are we trying to fit a square peg into a round hole and, looking elsewhere? So you mentioned that, you then had to make the decision, okay, mainstream schooling wasn't right for our son, not right for our family. What process was that like, starting to look at alternate settings? And I'm here in Sydney. I know you're over there in Perth in Western Australia. I know state-wise, all the options are different. Even where you live in the state can make your options limited, or greater depending on where you live. So what was that process like for you, starting to look at, okay, what else is available?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really hard when you kind of come from that preconceived idea of this is what you do. You pick the best possible school that's in either your local catchment, or in this case, we went to a private school because we thought that would give us more control and more options. But we really had to kind of come from step one and go, well, what else is out there and what can we look at? So certainly for us, we did a lot of research. We sort of tried to read a lot about the topic. That's when we started discovering how big this has become and how many people have been in a similar situation. We found a lot of Facebook groups very supportive. There's some quite big ones out there now, but this is how big the demand is. There is a national Facebook group now called School Can't that has been started by an organisation who's advocating in this space. I applied to join that group when this first happened, which was mid last year, and we still haven't been accepted.
Mid-2025.
Yeah, we still haven't been accepted into that group yet. That's how big the demand is, because they can only cater to a certain number of people at a time. But we joined a lot of different groups for different kind of programs, different groups for parents of autistic kids, homeschooling groups, and just did a lot of research and homework. The reality was, what we found is that there wasn't really a good solution for us. I spent a lot of time on the phone calling around different places, asking different therapists we worked with, speaking to, psychologists, all kind of people in this space to see what was out there. And there wasn't really a great option, because while there are schools here in WA that have some brilliant autism and neurodivergent specific programs, when we reached out to them, essentially it was a firm no. Like, most of them wouldn't even put us on a wait list. They said there's just no way that he's going to get into a program during his high school years, because they're 3-year potentially wait lists to get into them. And you essentially have to wait for someone to leave to get a spot. They're all completely full. So that was certainly something we experienced. We looked into things like the Montessori style model, because we considered whether something like that might be a bit more
flexible.
Open to us. Yeah, a bit more flexible. It's a little bit more interest-based learning, and it's not something we'd really considered when looking at high school. But again, we were sort of trying to not have preconceived ideas and look at everything. We reached out to a couple of local Montessori schools, and, as much as they were super open and supportive and gave us lots of great information, they also gave us similar feedback that coming in partway through a high school would have been different if we'd looked at this transition from primary school to high school. But because he'd started, we would be in a position that we would be on a wait list with a lot of other people, and essentially waiting for a child to leave or to move away to potentially be even considered for a spot. So we couldn't go down that path.
That's so interesting, Alecia, because I think what you're saying, and certainly what I've also seen, is that kids can cope quite well in primary school, and sometimes the school can't, or the school refusal kind of behaviors don't pop up until high school because of some of the challenges that we've already discussed. So you couldn't have preempted this. From what I understand, primary school was quite smooth for you guys.
Look, there was challenges, and there was times that was difficult, but not the same as it was for us in high school. But this can happen really at any age. And certainly from the clinic perspective, I'm having conversations with families now all of the time that are having different experiences at different times in the journey. And sometimes it is one or two little things that started the sort of snowball, but it really can happen to these, any child, but certainly neurodiverse children at any point can struggle with this. I've seen this transition between, kindergarten and pre-primary and year one can be a really difficult time. There can be triggers that can happen midway through primary school, or a change in teacher. You've gone from having a really
Yeah.
neurodivergent, aware and
Yep.
supportive teacher to a teacher who, and let's face it, there are still people in this world that don't believe neurodivergence is a real thing, that don't accommodate it, even if they have a diagnosis. That can certainly be a trigger for some. So for us, it was the high school change, but there's so many different things that can
There's
cause
so many. Yeah.
that kind of pressure. But unfortunately for us, it had been such a slow creep up for so long. And at that time for me, I didn't have the awareness that autism burnout is a thing. I've experienced burnout from a workplace point of view, or, as adults, but I didn't realize how pervasive that is in the autism space as well. And unfortunately, by the time we got to that point that we could have made potentially a change to an online school program, there's a number of schools out there that have online learning programs that we could have explored, or, as I say, Montessori, all these different models. By the time we reached that point, it was almost impossible for us to consider another pathway, because he was so exhausted, so burnt out, just needed that break, that time to start recover and rebuild, to be at a point we could even consider schooling again. So,
Yeah. So then you made the decision, okay, it looks like it was going to be homeschooling. Now, there's a lot of, I guess, misconceptions and ideas about what homeschooling is. And I know even homeschooling looks a little bit different depending on where you live. So you made the decision, okay, it's going to be homeschool. How did you kind of decide you're going to do it? And then what did you have to do to actually make that come to fruition? Because you have to go through registration and prove that you're actually going to do it and meet syllabus requirements, all of that kind of stuff. How did you go through that?
Gosh, it is a lot. And I guess I want to clarify at this point for us, and that's why I kind of like that term of the school can't. I don't feel like we actually had a choice. Like, we didn't make a choice to homeschool. We didn't have another viable option. So we explored this whole plethora of different ways we could go, but we couldn't physically get a space somewhere that could have been viable for us at that time.
Yeah.
Once a child reaches that point of school can't, where they just can't bear the idea of returning, as a psychologist, you'll understand how dangerous that is from a mental health perspective. So it's hard to say we made the choice to homeschool. It's not something we ever really talked about. It's not something I would have ever thought I would do. But you do, as a parent, what you need to do to make sure your family is happy and supported, and you do what you need to do. So at that point that we kind of said, well, that is really our best option. We essentially had a term that was a little bit of a hybrid with school, where technically he was still enrolled in his high school, but I did what they call unschooling. I did a fair bit of research around that, joined a lot of groups, read a lot of articles and resources. Lots of people probably say what we did wasn't technically unschooling, but essentially it was a term of a little bit of looking at school curriculum, but essentially just sitting with him and identifying areas of interest and doing school style learning, but around very much led by him, so we could actually just sort of break that cycle. So we spent most part of a term. So he has a very deep love of seals. So we learned a lot about seals and, the biology, the family names, the different types around the world. We watched a lot of documentaries, and we spent a lot of time doing those kind of things for a term to see if that was enough to get us to a point we could return to school. And while that was a really great experience and definitely was an improvement for us, at the end of that term, we still weren't in a position that we could even consider returning. So at that point, we went down the road of registering, notifying the school officially. And that was really hard, because it's not like we were in a school that wasn't supportive. And I certainly have heard from families that have had difficult experiences with schools, and we didn't have that. They were really sad for him to leave. I got quite emotional on the day that I went and picked up his stuff that was still in his locker from a term before. It was difficult, but it was the right thing for us and for him. At that
Did you
point,
grieve a little bit, Alecia? Did you go
absolutely.
through a grief process?
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, this wasn't sort of a choice, and a lot of families do make this choice. And, I admire that very much, that they do go down this path and they do a full homeschool curriculum. But it's challenging. And as you say, different states are different, and WA is a challenging state around homeschooling, because you do need to not just demonstrate that you're learning, you do need to demonstrate you're learning against the WA school curriculum. So you have to have a little bit more regulation around that. But I was,
and you don't have a teaching background?
No, look, I do lecture at university, so I've done a little bit, but I certainly don't have a teaching background. Didn't think this would necessarily work for us, but again, not much choice. You make these things work. So bless, AI. I think it's a massive tool for homeschooling these days in helping it analyze what is out there and what a curriculum that is often written in very technical academic style language, what it actually means in reality, being able to add some layers and lens over there, over the top of that, of what your child enjoys and what their experiences are, diagnosis, etc., and be able to help you develop something that is feasible. There are also, as I discovered, a lot of homeschool programs out there where you can buy essentially a homeschool program out of the box. That wasn't the right choice for us. And as I started to say, we were really, really lucky, because I know not every family is, in that the education department representative that came out and did our initial meeting was an ex-teacher, was a mum herself, had quite a bit of experience of neurodivergent and understood where we were coming from, and also accepted that we would be doing a restricted or lesser curriculum. So we aren't necessarily expected to do every single subject that he would have if he was in mainstream school, because that's a really difficult thing to be able to manage. And certainly for families that might be a single parent household, and we see a lot of that, or, a family that has 4 or 5 children, that the others may still be in school, or they may all be homeschooled. It is a lot to try and balance working and homeschooling, and it just has to look different. You don't have a choice. It can't be a standard 9 to 3 sort of school day, because it's not going to work for most families. So we were very lucky in that we had some flexibility, and I'll be honest and say what we're doing is probably quite imperfect, but I have seen my child come back to being himself, and we lost that for a while. He's happy again. His personality, his humor's come back. That for us was the most important thing. And the thing that I've seen is, today's world, there are a lot more paths to education and learning than there were sort of when I was his age. There are programs, and something I've learned from being in these homeschool groups, we get universities come and post in there going, hey, did you know we have this bridging program now for homeschooled kids into university? There are so many different pathways that didn't exist before. So when I had to make the choice between his happiness, well-being and mental health versus learning, there really wasn't a choice for us.
Yeah, absolutely. You kind of touched on it a little bit there, but I'm so interested. What has surprised you about homeschooling in the positive sense?
I think that for a lot of families that there is flexibility there, and homeschool looks really different for lots of different people. I found so many different interesting things out there. There are like co-op style programs all around the country where you can go and group homeschool your child with other families. There are, as I said, programs out there where you can go and buy something out of the box and essentially do like an online learning program. There are lots of tools and resources. I mean, it wouldn't have been like this 10, 20 years ago when we didn't have AI and technology and apps and things like we have now, and ready access to internet. But there are some really amazing things, and it certainly has made me reflect on what we do learn, because I've found homeschooling, there's a lot of things almost I've had to relearn myself to teach. And then that makes me question,
How well did you know it?
Yeah. How important is some of the things, who is it that has actually said, these are the 7 things that you must know? Because I learned these things in school. I remember learning some of these things in school, but I don't remember them now. I have to go back and relearn them to teach them. And then it makes you ask the question of, is this the right pathway for everybody? It is really a broad curriculum at this age that touches on a lot of different subjects to give you lots of different opportunities, versus what homeschool allows you to do, which is to lean into areas of interest. If your child has passions and interests and things that they love, you can go into those in greater detail and explore those. And is that not going to lead to a better career opportunity in life later, that they were able to focus on something? So it is really hard to know. And there are definitely scary moments and things I worry about, but there are also a lot of positive things as well when we're sort of discovering things that we enjoy learning and that we enjoy spending time on together.
Yeah, great. And what's then been the biggest challenge then, Alecia?
I think it's the challenge of being, a mum and being a family member, and also then trying to be teacher, because the dynamic is different, the relationship is different. And this may not be the case for all families. There certainly are people who do this very well and navigate it without any challenges. I found that hard because it wasn't a choice that I made that I wanted to do that. It was something I kind of fell into. So I think that dynamic can be difficult because it's not the same as somebody else saying, well, you need to sit down and get this work done and be able to explain why you need to learn these things. You know, it's kind of me muddling through, figuring out the best I can. So that's definitely challenging. But a thought just pops in my head from the last section of the positives. I really have held on to a story that I saw in one of the homeschool groups that I joined. And there was a mum who posted and said she's seen a lot of questions from mums in similar positions to me going, what's my child's future going to look like? And she just wanted to share a story. And she said their homeschooling was they weren't in WA, they were in a different state where there's more flexibility, was very life skills based. So they said we never did a formal curriculum. We never did traditional such subjects. Everything was very much about just getting out and exploring the world and learning based on interests, more the unschooling sort of style. So they never had a formal curriculum. And she just shared that her daughter had just applied for and been accepted to a marine biology degree in, I think it was La Trobe University. And that for me was a really positive thing to see and go, okay, there are other pathways and there are other opportunities.
Yeah, especially with the love of seals, maybe that's in your future. Who knows?
Who knows?
I guess a lot of families would worry that moving into homeschooling about the socialization component, and that's definitely something that I hear from people worrying about kids that are homeschooled. How do they go with socializing with same age peers? I mean, for some kids that are neurodivergent, that is a challenge anyway, and that's one of the challenging things about school. But I'm just wondering, how do you personally navigate this within your family?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And it's something we were certainly concerned about. One of our fabulous OTs had a really interesting insight into this because my concern was making the change that it would remove that social dynamic completely and cause more challenges down the track. But she sort of said, well, there's also another way to look at it with neurodivergent kids as well, is that when you take away that constant level of pressure, of that sensory overwhelm, of all of these demands that's put on them during the day, and you take that stress away, that a lot of these kids over time actually have a greater capacity to be social and have a greater capacity for extracurriculars and things like that over time once they don't have that demand. I thought that was a
They're
really
not getting that
interesting
burnout.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought that was a really interesting lens. And I guess I certainly come back to every person is really, really different. And it's certainly something I see with the clinic. You know, I talk to families where they're like, you know, my child is really social. They love to make friends. It's their favorite thing. Their social skills maybe aren't quite where other kids their age are, but they really enjoy it. I speak
And they
to
have
people
that
who
desire to be friends with other people. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I speak to families who are struggling with school, but their kids play, you know, 6 different sports and do all these extracurriculars. So they're all really different. For us, the social element definitely has been challenging. So we had to look a little bit outside the square. And certainly, if you know much about autism burnout, you'll know one of the elements of that comes with a sort of a shut off from social interaction. Social interactions become too much. So we really stopped having any kind of social interactions with anybody for some time, which was challenging. Again, we live in an amazing digital world. So one of the things I found was through a company called OutSchool, which is an international organization. And I signed my son up for a social club around a game that he loves. And he was getting up at 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning to join this social group to be able to talk to other kids all over the globe about this game that they all loved playing. So social skills can look different in different families and at different stages. So I think that will change with time. But the reality is there's a perception with homeschool that the social element isn't there, but there are so many opportunities. There are so many businesses now who run homeschooling sessions of things during the day at sporting organizations. Yeah. There are homeschool sports clubs. There are homeschool social groups. There are things like that all over Australia now. So there are opportunities. It just really comes down to what suits you and your family at the time. But I think that's certainly when you asked me what surprised me, that was definitely surprised me, is that there are so many resources, be it online or in person, that you can explore if that is something that concerns you and you want to look into the homeschool options.
And I imagine with the demand getting more, there's more kids being homeschooled or going to alternate schooling settings, that those kind of opportunities are only going to grow because there's going to be so much more kids that need those kind of services. So that's great to hear that you found that those been available. And that online group sounds amazing. You'll have to tell me more about that offline. Can you tell me what a typical day now looks like for you and your son? I mean, I'm sure every day is a little bit different, but you
Yeah.
mentioned you've got a job, you've owned this clinic, you're lecturing at university. What does a typical day kind of look like for you guys now?
I think you hit the nail on the head that there isn't always such a thing as a typical day. And I've had to adjust my expectations as we go. So I came into this with, even I have to say, the lovely lady from the education department came out. I had a very detailed curriculum built and I'd written all this stuff. And even she looked at it and she's like, I think there's too much in this and you're going to put yourself under too much pressure. This is where the expectations are. As long as we get to kind of this, then, we're comfortable with that. And that was good to sort of help me take some of the pressure off a little bit. And there's a real mix. So on any given day, sometimes homeschooling, you don't have to be learning for large periods of time. And that's certainly something I have learned. There are times with using online tools and being able to do lessons one-on-one that I can see that we can achieve something in a intensive half an hour session that it might have taken my son, 3 weeks of English lessons to get to a point where he could have written or produced something like what we did in one half an hour intensive one-on-one, being able to sit and talk about something and then just get it done. Because certainly in a classroom, there's a lot of listening, there's a lot of chatting, there's distractions, there's all these things that can take quite a bit of time for something to sink in. Whereas when you're learning one-on-one, you can get through sometimes the materials a lot faster. And that's something I've had to realize, that it's not about how much time you spend as so much as the quality of what you do. And there are days where things are hard and we come up on something through one of our different tools we might be using that we're working on together that's really difficult. So we have to sit and figure it out and experiment and try and work it out and go through a bit of a process, and those lessons can take longer than we expected. Other days, sometimes with something we do, just it's a good day, it captures our interest, it makes sense, and we can get through a great deal of work really, really quickly and only spend a really short amount of time on a topic that I would have thought would have taken us a longer time. Certainly a lot of it is life bound, and this is one of the reasons why I ended up, taking over an allied health clinic, because I realized it was, of all things, a business where no one was going to look twice, that I would have my son at work with me. So a lot of days is that we sort of get up and get organized early. We sit and do our homeschooling. We spend time doing learning in the morning. Then he comes to work with me and he learns about business and he learns about working with other people in the community. And the amazing thing is he gets to see other neurodivergent adults working in a career, being successful and doing great things in a workplace. And I think that has been really great for him as well, to be able to see and experience a little bit more of that firsthand. So
He's getting
as
some
you
work
say,
experience.
yeah, exactly. And the plan absolutely is for, as he gets a little older, for him to be able to take on part-time work and have a bit of a hybrid and be able to work in the business with me as it grows a little bit as well. There's some amazing life skills and opportunities out of that. I mean, in year 9, they learn economics. So that unit has been very much based around the business. Okay, well, this is how we do it. So when you talk about how banks work or how money works, we talk about everything in the context of, okay, well, you've seen this at the business and this is how it works here. That's given us a really interesting lens. So an imperfect model, it requires a lot of support. We're very lucky we have a lot of family that help out and spend time with him and have him, we'll come and pick him up and watch documentaries and learn about new things, and they'll teach him other skills of things that I wouldn't have even thought of sharing. So it takes a village, but we make it work. It's imperfect and it will change with time, particularly for us as burnout continues to lessen and capacity increases. Then hopefully we'll be able to do more, and maybe homeschooling's not the long-term answer for us. Maybe things will change in the future, but at the moment I'm really letting my son lead that decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And keeping him at the center of it. That's fantastic. A question, like from a kind of professional perspective from you, Alecia, you mentioned the clinic and that you've got a team of allied health professionals. Would you recommend a family that's facing a similar kind of situation to yourself kind of last year, and you're considering your options and working out what's out there? Would you recommend them going and speaking to some allied health professionals, whether that be
Yeah.
psychologists, OTs, speech pathologists, whoever it might be, about that decision and the struggles that their children might be having?
Absolutely. And it's part of the reason that the path led me to moving into allied health. This isn't my background. I've been in business for a long time, but I've mainly been working in the nonprofit sector, teaching marketing and social media and business growth. So this was a very different trajectory for me. And part of that decision was around what was going on in our life. But it was also reflecting on the fact that when we didn't know what to do, we didn't have the answers, we were overwhelmed, and we were in a really challenging space as a family, that allied health professionals are what helped us. As much as I think our medical system is wonderful in Australia when we compare it against somewhere like what happens in the States, the reality is you go to a GP, you go to a pediatrician, they're all overrun, have so much demand, you get very short appointments. There's only so many solutions they can offer you in those very small windows of time. For us, allied health really made a huge difference. We were very, very lucky to have had an incredible OT that we've worked with for many, many years, who was able to give us a lot of advice and direction, and maybe not all the answers, but was certainly able to go, okay, I've seen this in other families and here's things they've explored and different programs, and pointed us in the direction of things we could look at. We worked with a psychologist who was amazing and supported us through the journey as well. So I definitely would encourage anyone who is struggling, particularly if you're neurodivergent, if you have kids under NDIS, you do have access to a wealth of amazing people who have seen this before and experienced it before, and can help, at the very least, make you feel less alone, but at the most give you tools and strategies and things to identify, like they did with us, that burnout was a massive part of our challenge that we didn't even realize until that was brought to our attention. And that certainly was the right path for us, because we've seen that change over times. I think allied health is a wonderful area of support on top of, your pediatrician, your GP, and the people in your family if you are struggling with mental health. And if you do have those resources, I do encourage people to explore that and do seek professional help, whether that's you as a parent just getting support through the stress and pressure that this journey can bring on you and the family, or whether it is directly with your child, depending on obviously the age of your child and the stage that you're going through.
Yeah. Fantastic, Alecia. I think that that's great advice, and coming from not just from your professional hat, I think there was, your personal hat speaking there as well, and how beneficial it was for you and your family. So I'm really glad to hear that you've got some great professionals working with you and your son, because it can make all the difference. And like you said, this is your journey right now. You don't know what the journey is in the future, but you've got a team around you that can make sure that you continue to hold him and his well-being at the center of all the decisions that you make as a family. I want to acknowledge, for those listening at home that might be on the same journey and working out what kind of schooling system might be beneficial for their child. It's such a complex decision, and there's no one answer or one right decision that would fit every child or every neurodivergent child. It's such an individualized decision, and it's a process that needs to be really considered. And exactly like you've just said there, I would encourage those families to lean on their supports and have conversations with people maybe that have done it before, or that have some insight. Do their research and really work out what's in their best interest. And exactly like you said, it might be, a temporary a decision, and they might have some capacity to engage in, another form of schooling later on. But I think I'm so happy to hear that for you guys, that it's working out at the moment. I think that that's so positive. But understanding your child, keeping them at the center of that decision. And, I love what you said before about that, your connection with the child, you keeping, whether you're the teacher or the mum, you're being really mindful of kind of what the balances of that is, because that can be really, really challenging. But it sounds like you've really kept him at the center of all your decisions, which is fantastic. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I've learned a lot from listening to you, and I know that this conversation is going to be really meaningful to lots of people that are listening. So I appreciate your time. If there's anyone else that's listening that's going through this, maybe you've transitioned to homeschooling, or maybe you're considering a transition to an alternate setting, and you've got a story that you'd like to share with us, please let us know. Maybe you've gone to homeschooling or an alternate setting and then transitioned back to mainstream. I'd love to know how that journey went for you and your child as well. Please let us know. But Alecia, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. And thank you for helping us have such an important conversation, because this is a growing challenge for a lot of families. And certainly I felt very alone when I came into it. I felt very overwhelmed and didn't really know where to go. And now that I'm on the other side of it and I am in that allied health space, I'm hearing it from other families as well. And that feeling of not doing the right thing or not knowing what you can and can't do, it is a really difficult thing to go through. So I think at the very least, topics like this and podcasts like this, it helps people realize, if nothing else, you're not alone. You're not doing anything wrong. You're just in a different period or stage in your life, and there's no right or wrong answer. But I think it's really important to know that others are going through it too, that it is its own form of normal. So thank you for bringing this topic out there.
No, you're so welcome. Absolutely, exactly what you said. I think we need to normalize struggle, and that these conversations don't need to be, kept secret or private, and destigmatize some of talking about this stuff, because I think it's so important. If anyone's listening and this has been helpful, or you think it would be interesting to someone that you know, please forward on this podcast episode and let someone know that you found it helpful, and let's reconnect again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening today. If you found the information in this episode helpful or interesting, please subscribe, rate this podcast, or share it with a friend. Remember, if anything we spoke about has brought up concerns for you or someone you care about, please reach out to a qualified mental health professional. I'll leave some information and numbers in the show notes that you can check out if you need to reach out to speak to anybody. Let's reconnect again next week.